Yeah, it was my kids that gave me the mental strength to fight it. It was my kids who've given me the good days. It was my kids who gave me the strength. It
Mm,
was them coming along and giving me cuddles, the day after I was diagnosed, coming and cuddling up in bed with me and telling me it would be okay, which for a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old is just everything.
Welcome to the Motherhood Clinic, a podcast about caring for mothers after childbirth, led by clinical experience and real-life stories. If you're a new mum and ever asked yourself, is what I'm going through normal? Should I be worried? Or who should I ask for help? This podcast is for you. It's for anyone navigating those early weeks, months, or even years after having a baby. Each episode brings together voices from across the motherhood journey, from clinicians, experts, and mothers from all walks of life. We're here to help you feel more empowered in your unique motherhood journey. We believe in a better start to motherhood.
Welcome, Dale. Thank you for joining us on the Motherhood Clinic. I'm glad we were able to make this time. Your story is one that I think everyone can relate to. I'll give you a chance in a moment to tell your story, but as a very brief background, you had a successful career in finance, the wife, the kids, the house, everyone can follow that journey. And then I think life hit hard, pretty hard. So I'll let you talk about what that was. But this conversation today, given our audience of new mothers that are out there, this is a conversation. I think there's two things that really struck with me, one around resilience and one around hope. And what does it mean to make the most out of adversity? So that's what I think the framing of today's conversation is. And it's still obviously a journey that you're still living through. So I'd love to hand over to you, Dale, and tell a bit of your story, and then we'll paint a picture of where we're going to go for today's conversation. Sound good?
Of course. First of all, hello, everybody. I'm Dale Atkinson. So to give you a brief sort of background on my story, where to start? The middle of last year, my partner had a bit of a funny turn. Unfortunately, they thought she'd had a heart attack. They rushed her into hospital. After a few tests later, they found out that she actually had a small cell lung cancer. So fast forward to the end of September, beginning of October last year, 2024. She went into St Thomas's in London and had a full lobectomy. So she had the entire upper right lobe of her lung removed. And that was on the 3rd of October. Fast forward a couple of days to our youngest son's first birthday, which was on the 15th of October. And I went in to have what was at the time deemed to be a relatively routine endoscopy. Now, I'd been suffering with heartburn for a couple of years. I had a relatively stressful job and lifestyle for many years, and we just thought it was sort of part and parcel of that. And my GP sort of agreed and didn't think it was anything nefarious or too interesting. So, routine pathway, put me in for an endoscopy. Unfortunately, during that endoscopy, they found a rather large esophageal tumor. So, just at the junction between my esophagus and my stomach, they found what we later found out was a 9.2 centimeter esophageal adenocarcinoma. With that, they then took me in for a number of scans and they identified secondaries all across my lymph nodes. So I had somewhere between 8 and 12 lymph nodes involved. I had a secondary attached to my aorta. We now think, with having done a subject access request for my patient records, we think there was also another one on the neck of my pancreas, and there were a few more sort of dotted all over my my abdomen as well. A week or so after that, on the 27th of October, unfortunately, my mother died, and we were notified the next morning, which was my eldest son's third birthday. And the day after that, I then went in and had my first meeting with my oncologist and was notified, or actually with a surgeon, not an oncologist at that point, and was notified that I had a stage 4 diagnosis, which unfortunately meant that I was terminal. So I was put as inoperable, incurable, and was told that the only routes available to me at that point in time were palliative. Fast forward another couple of weeks, and it was the day after my mother's funeral. Seems to coincide with a lot of bad dates in my life, these things. Fast forward to the day after my mother's funeral, and unfortunately, we were then given my prognosis. And at that point, it stood at an 11.5-month prognosis from diagnosis. So they believed that I would be dead by the middle of September, end of September 2025. Hopefully that gives a little bit of background on what happened. Do you want me to jump into what happened next, Patrick?
Yeah, I just take a moment just to Wow, I mean, I know you've mentioned this story, and you know you write actively about it, and we will jump into this. But it's just taking a moment, like what a crushing period that must be. And you know, in the context of this conversation, you know, mothers, fathers, it's just that it's not just happening to you. Obviously, it's the whole family as well. So I think, yeah, just taking a moment, like what a crushing period, right? You must be thinking, what the hell's going on and what's happened? And, you know, part of where we want to go with this conversation is, yeah, looking at, you know, what happened next, what you did with that, how you cope with it. And then, you know, how do you navigate something as tragic as this? So yes, I'd love to, if as much as you're comfortable sharing, it would be good to go in there and consider, like, how do you work your way through this stuff? There isn't already a trodden path, is there? So where did you go next with all of this?
So I went the same place that a lot of us do. So I started to feel very down. I started to feel very depressed. I kept wondering why this had happened to me specifically. We were also at a point in time when my partner, because of her lung cancer surgery, she wasn't able to pick up the kids. She wasn't able to pick up anything heavy, to move anything, or particularly do anything in the household at that point because she was still in recovery. So there was me having had this diagnosis, having had my mother died all in a very short space of time, who didn't feel mentally capable of dealing with it, who was at the very much the verge of breaking, and also then had to pick up and help my partner with just day-to-day home life. She couldn't hug the kids, she couldn't put them to bed. So we were at a stage where I then had to push through what was going on in my life. I had to push through the diagnosis, the prognosis, and all of the horrible things that were happening to me in order to be here and support my kids and my partner. And that, I think, is what gave me the first sort of lease and sort of piece of resilience, as it were, was the
Mm.
fact that I couldn't leave my partner and my kids in that position. I had to fight through it. I had to find the motivation to get up in the morning, to be able to cook them breakfast, to be able to look after them, to dress them for school, to all these things. I had to be able to do those things. So I ended up pushing through my own emotions and ignoring and avoiding my own emotions in order to be able to do that for them. With that, thankfully, a little bit for me, and it's a bit strange to say this well, it's a bit strange to say this in general, but we also now look back on it as a bit of a, maybe not a godsend, but a good thing that I was given the terminal diagnosis, that I was given the prognosis I was. Because with the NHS unable to help me at that point in time, I
Mm.
began to use my spare time to look into alternatives. Now, that's not to say I avoided the NHS completely. I still went forward and had chemotherapy and immunotherapy over the longer term. But it meant that I was more open to looking at what we now deem to be complementary therapies. So I began looking at things like hyperbaric oxygen, red light therapy, the use of off label medications. So those which are safety profiled, which have trial backing, etc. So looking at things like the use of metformin, which is classically a diabetes drug, but has a lot of science around its use in an oncological, in a cancer setting. So I went off and began researching these sorts of things. Now, I ended up putting an infrared sauna in the house, as we were talking about just before this, actually.
Mm.
I was using ice baths at that point in time as well. I was using a lot of these things that you see longevity and health people use for overall health. I was using them, but in a cancer setting in order to spike and sort of cover different pathways that my cancer had picked up. With that, I then ended up coming across a very knowledgeable doctor based out of the Cromwell Hospital in London called Dr. Andy Geyer. He then put me onto something called next generation sequencing. And I began researching heavily into what next generation sequencing was, how it worked, and what the sort of impact it would have on my overall cancer journey would be. And I essentially narrowed down the idea to a relatively simple notion. That is, where we do genetic testing for other diseases, we don't do very much within the NHS setting for cancer.
Mhm.
So I got a company called Astron Health, who were a next generation sequencing company. Having spoken to lots of them, became my preference. They took the NHS biopsy of my tumor, so a piece of my tumor, alongside a liquid biopsy, so blood. They then ran that through a DATAR test, or a test via a company called DATAR, and did their own extrapolation on top of it. And they were then able to provide me with a full genetic list of the markers and the pathways that my tumor, my specific cancer, was using. Now, in my case, because mine was what's called a differentiated tumor, so it didn't share all of the classic hallmarks of an adenocarcinoma in other circumstances, It meant that I then had a better understanding of what drove my cancer. It meant that I knew it was glycolytic, so it used glucose or sugar in order to feed on, that it
Mhm.
also used glutamate, and that it also used things like cortisol and adrenaline as well. So stress hormones and the ones that we excrete when we're under pressure, when we're fighting things. So I then started to get a very good sort of understanding of how my tumor worked, what pathways it needed to feed on, how it existed, why it existed, and what I could then do and which medications and treatments I could then use in order to combat it atop those being offered by the NHS. And what I then ended up doing was using that next generation sequencing with an incredible oncologist, or integrative oncologist called Dr. Harry Kuhn, who's become an absolute savior for me. He's one of my favorite human beings ever at this point in time. So I
Awesome.
used him and a naturopath called Dr. Amanda King, who is a truly brilliant naturopath as well, and got the two of them to essentially help me to create my own protocol. And that was using everything from off label medications to day to day supplements as well. So looking at the use of vitamin D, selenium, through to even, the weird, wonderful things like talking about methylene blue. We had lots of discussions about some of the weird and wonderful things that you see crop up on social media these days. I didn't end up using a lot of those because the science doesn't necessarily support the use of them. And we tried to base everything into as pure evidence as we could and as advanced evidence as we could. So looking for phase 3 trials, looking for large scale evidence and bodies of proof within the medical literature. And I ended up reading somewhere between 4 and 6,000 medical papers and articles and research papers over the course of about 3.5 months in order to help me define some of this. And with that came a lot of sort of pieces of knowledge that just aren't out there in the mainstream, but really should be. So looking at things like in the 90s, there was a Nobel Prize winning piece of biology by a gent called Otto Warburg. Now, Dr. Warburg posited that cancers were glycolytic in nature, that you could then use a low sugar, low glucose focused diet in order to essentially put pressure onto the tumor and to basically starve it of its food sources. So he posited that back in the 1920s, and it won the Nobel Prize for biology in 1932, I think it was, or 1936, somewhere around there. And for some reason, these bits of science seem to have been hidden by time and hidden by, the latest advancements in modern science. So I went back to a lot of these, pieced together some of the bits and pieces that I felt made the most sense, and then used that with modern science as well to create an overarching protocol that has then led me to, well, as of now, as of we're talking right now, I have some latent metabolic activity left, but that is it. So I have gone from a 9.2 centimeter main tumor with multiple metastases to having no metastases at all. And I've had no surgery, by the way. I have had chemo and I have had immunotherapy, but I've had no surgery, no anything else. As I sit here now, I have a little bit of thickening of my esophageal wall left, and I'm looking at being NED, which is essentially full remission. So, as far as the NHS will class me, NED is no evidence of disease, and it's the best stage 4 cancer patient can get. And I should be there by my next scan, so early next year.
That's incredible. I mean, that's just such an incredible journey. And I'm so, it's really heartwarming to hear just the progress you've made. And as you're talking, I think there's almost like there's two stories that we can go into more detail around. Our audience is primarily obviously first time mothers and mothers going through childbirth and the first year. But there's also a healthy number of clinicians that will be listening to this conversation and those specialists that we work with. And there's kind of two parts I think that are very interesting to explore in this conversation. I think in the first instance, there was like what the reaction that you had in response to this diagnosis. You talked about how one, it led you off down a route of education, far more than I think most people might initially do, but that was driven by purpose. And I wanted to touch one thing I'll come back to you on is, it's clear the value of people finding that level of purpose to go through adversity, number one. But there's also a balance where sometimes when you have these, the shoulds and the must haves, and I have to, can sometimes put an undue pressure as well. That for you turned into something as a key motivating drive to make you go and to show up for your family, to force you into, to avoid spending too much time in that dark pit, and it forces you to do something. But it can also sometimes have an adverse effect where you have too many shoulds and too many must-haves, where it becomes
Yeah.
overwhelming. So I wanted to ask you a bit about how you balance that. And obviously, again, it led you down a very productive route and a useful one. But how did you balance that? And what was, I mean, was it conscious? Is it, how did you react to that? And maybe something for people listening in, like, when new mothers have all these shoulds and must-haves, and how do they find their purpose? And what was some reflections on that time for you?
So I think the biggest learning from that time for me is that nobody else matters. And that sounds harsh, that sounds horrible to say. But when you're at that sort of inflection point, as we were, my partner and I, once we had our children, you need to stop and focus on what really matters. And that generally tends to be the two of you, that tends to be getting through the day. It tends to be finding the small things that you have to do above all else and focusing down on those. So at that point in time, we didn't speak to many friends. We cut a lot of people from our lives, not really on purpose, but because we didn't have the bandwidth to do both. We didn't have the bandwidth to keep updating people, to tell people what was going on. We didn't
Mm,
have the bandwidth to listen to our friends crying on the phone to us, which happened a few times at the beginning. We didn't have the time and the effort to put into family outside of our singular family unit. Very thankfully for me, my dad was absolutely fantastic during this time and kept tabs and helped us to disseminate that information wider to our family. So kept my brothers updated, kept the wider family updated for us, etc. To cut down a lot of that burden for us
hmm
and allowed us to essentially just concentrate on getting through each individual day, one day at a time, just focusing on what we absolutely had to do and what was necessary, which cut out a lot of the noise. It cut out a lot of that expectation and that overwhelm as well.
mm,
For some reason at this time, I also decided it was a really good idea because I'd gone searching for a voice sort of similar to what I was trying to do. I'd gone looking for anybody, ideally a medical doctor, somebody with that sort of background who could point me at different things and directions.
mm,
Sadly, I hadn't found anyone else with a similar voice. So, despite having tried to cut everything down, I also, for some reason, found myself writing on LinkedIn on a daily basis,
mm,
trying to become a voice that I didn't find exist or didn't manage to locate myself at that point in time. And weirdly, I found a lot of solace and a lot of good in actually putting out my story.
mm,
It didn't come very naturally to me. I'm not somebody who particularly enjoys sharing my story, who particularly enjoys sharing, the intricate details of my life or the intimate details of my life. But I found that there was a lot of kinship with people online, putting out there what I was doing, how I was doing it, why I was doing it. A
mm,
lot of people reached out to tell me they were in a similar situation and to give me hope, to give me information, to support me along this journey. And one thing I would say to anybody else who does come across this sort of a journey is please don't hold back sharing
mm,
just on the basis of, a pre-inbuilt want not to. If you think that there is anything in your journey that can help somebody, you will also find that they can help you too.
mm,
And I found a lot of hope in that. I found a lot of hope in the people reaching out on a daily basis, spurring me onwards, first of all. Second of all, giving me stories of their own hope and their own protocols that they designed, their own ways and treatments that they had discovered along their own journeys that were of use to them and had helped, in a lot of cases, help them to also treat and cure their own cancers in different ways.
yeah, that's incredible. That's incredible. And it is a conversation we've had with other podcasts, to kind of connect the dots when people have gone through a level of adversity, how they cope with that publicly and privately, and the choice that various people make to connect with others. Sometimes the immediate view is, yeah, I want to keep that to myself. It's very private. It's something I don't want to share with the world. And everyone obviously has a choice in there. And I think that's something that I can relate to growing up. This idea of I didn't want to air my troubles with the world and people to, this idea of gossip and etc. But the flip side of that, which I've come to really appreciate, and as you've clearly gained from as well, is this idea of, in a healthy setting, finding those communities online or offline where you can find people are going through similar journeys, or to help other people going through what you're going through too. You know, the idea of you putting this out there to help others people whilst you yourself are in need of support as well is a great way that I've personally understood to get over or to help with the troubles you're going through. You helping someone else going through what you're having trouble with as well is a really insightful way to understand yourself, but also get to understand your condition through a different perspective. So I think that's, you know, something I can certainly relate to in terms of the practice, which I think is fantastic. Yeah,
And as a society and as a community, we're better together. You know,
absolutely.
having these things in complete isolation is not good for either people's mental state or for their ability to help themselves. And it's
Mm,
often exactly as you said, Patrick. It's often, you know, reaching out to other people helps us to actually help ourselves, because often they're asking the same question that we're struggling with, and being able to look at it from a different perspective is what then helps us to solve it for ourselves and helps us to make that decision properly.
yeah, that's great. And I'd love to kind of follow that path in terms of the journey you've taken, are taking, and are going forward now. You know, you've started a charity, you've also done your own business, which you can share as much as you can. But there's been obviously your personal journey, like seeing the tangible difference to your physical and mental health through the things that you have discovered yourself. So I'd love to jump in to some of those discoveries and also talk about the relationship between what you've discovered in, you know, whether you call it alternative or holistic and private world versus what, well, in condition, and what you've also gained from what is out there publicly right now with the NHS, and how those two work together, where there's certain gaps, and what that looks like together. So I'd love to go into that story and discuss that journey and your discoveries in that.
I'll go for a general overall idea and feeling that I've sort of discovered. And tying that into, especially into motherhood, and tying that into parentalhood in general as well. So, as we found both along our pregnancy journeys with our two boys, and through this health journey that both my partner and I have both experienced now from a cancer perspective, we have discovered that, first of all, the NHS is an incredible thing. The NHS is an absolutely amazing institution that does a lot of good, that the practitioners within are generally fantastic and who are desperately trying to help people. However, the NHS is also a very large, very slow moving beast. And it is not always at the forefront of, first of all, modern science. And second of all, it's not always able to adapt to an individual personalized basis. And I say this on the basis that when looking at cancer, we discovered that my cancer, especially, was glycolytic. Now, not all cancers are. And if you look at things like prostate cancers, which is very prevalent, they are fed on amino acids and all these other things. But my specific instance was glucose fed. Its
Mm,
main feeder was sugar in any way, shape, or form. And I went into a meeting with the NHS, and they brought in a nutritionist, an oncologist, and all this into this mixed disciplinary type meeting. And they sat me down and told me to eat lots of sugar. They told me to, you know, use this as an excuse to eat a tub of ice cream every day, because I needed to put on lots of weight in order to deal with the chemotherapy.
mm,
Now, looking at and understanding the science, that is the worst possible thing I could have done to my body at that point in time. It causes huge amounts of inflammation. It causes huge amounts of issues left, right, and center with the body. It would have actually put me in a far worse position going into chemotherapy had I done what they told me to do. I instead decided and realized from my own readings that that was the worst thing I could do. And instead, I went to a vegetarian keto diet. The body adapts. The body is there in its own way to try and soak up nutrients. It's not there to just eat for two. You shouldn't be looking at, you know, high calorie diets in order to support the body. Instead, you should be looking at nutrient density. And it's a case of trying to find where the line between what the NHS's intention, what they're actually telling you, and what the real science says. Now, for us, we found that there is a line right in the middle of those, which draws together the standard of care, which is the NHS, draws together the standard of care with the actual underlying science, and finds the middle ground that kind of works for everything the NHS is trying to do, as well as we were trying to do for my body. And we found the same thing for our pregnancy journeys as well. Anna went onto a very sort of specific diet with a good amount of protein, with bone broths, with lots of supportive nutrients, etc., which wasn't necessarily picked up and pointed at by the NHS in our instance, She was also told that she was eating for two and she could eat whatever she wanted, and it really didn't matter in pregnancy. But looking back at it, it does make a huge difference. And
Mm.
the one thing I would point out to anybody listening to this is that clinicians, especially, do have limitations, and that you can't, unfortunately, rely on a doctor to be everything because, as we all know, knowledge is finite. There's no one person who knows everything. There is no one person who is an absolute specialist in every field of medicine. Doctors are specialists in a singular point of medicine.
Mm.
So I think in the case of your wife, it's obstetrics and gynecology. I think in lots of other cases, in the case of people I deal with, it's oncology. Those doctors are not specialists in nutrition at the same time, or in very few instances, they tend to be specialists in things like nutrition at the same time. So looking at the wider care and what you need to do for yourself, your doctor often isn't the best point of call for anything outside of the specialist area of medicine that they know. And
Mm.
my call to people at this point in time is to be their own advocates, to do their own research, and to make sure that they are well informed about what the overarching sort of holistic view of their health is within those contexts, and to then stand up for themselves for it.
Yeah. And that's certainly, and thank you for sharing that, Dale. There's certainly themes in there that are becoming far more prominent, I feel, in terms of consumers' attitude and understanding of healthcare today. So, number one, this idea of, you know, going out and doing your own research and forming your own opinions. There are some great resources now. And just this idea that, as you said, my wife still works full time with the NHS. Sometimes the challenge is, we see the NHS as just as one big blanket. And obviously within there, the challenge is there's lots of different pockets depending on your local hospital, the doctor you have, and the relationship you have with them. There's a lot of nuance to that. The key message that I'm taking away from what you mentioned is there's a level of responsibility, accountability, and onus on the person themselves to take ownership of their own health and their own understanding to meet them where they are or where they can be with the NHS. But there's also another side of this happening in parallel, which is the family situation, right? And how you can, and what is the journey you go through with your family. And so I'm talking here about how do we communicate these kind of events with the children, and how do you adapt as a family? Are there things, if you're willing to share, okay, with like how people, when they with this level of adversity, how do we cope that as a family unit now? So we're talking more just like the practical day to day, and how do you communicate that in the best way and equip, on the more personal side?
So yeah, I think that's a really interesting question and a really interesting way to go, Patrick. So for me, at that point in time, in the day I was identified, the day I was diagnosed initially was my youngest son's first birthday. And 2 weeks later, it was my eldest son's third birthday. So unfortunately for us, our kids were not at a stage where they could fully understand sort of the concept of what was going on. So we chose to take a bit of a step back. We chose to be really honest with them and tell them exactly what was happening, and to try and sit and be there emotionally for them with anything they might struggle with. Very thankfully for us, our boys seemed to be extremely resilient and they took it completely in their stride.
Mm.
I've got a fun story to tell you about that in a second, but first of all, yeah, we sat down, we told them that daddy had cancer, we told them what cancer was, we told them what impact it would have. We were very honest with them about daddy's prognosis. And sorry, it's very weird to be talking about myself in the third person as daddy. I don't know why it started out that way. Yeah, we sat Axel and Cole down. So Axel is my now 4-year old and Cole is my now 2-year old, who are 1 and 3 at the time. And we were very straightforward with them. We were very honest. We told them what cancer was. They had a bit of an idea and an understanding because of Anna's cancer journey as well. We sat them down and we told them that I might not be here in a year's time. And we told them that, we loved them very, very much. And we made sure to emphasize that we would make as much time and make as much effort around them as we could. But ultimately, there was no way to help a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old understand that their father was dying. There was no way to really get through to them what the concept of terminal cancer really was, and that this wasn't normal, and that they shouldn't have to go through this, but they were.
Mm.
Yeah, I don't really know what more to say on that one. It was just one of those things where we had to push through it no matter what. There wasn't really any other way to do it.
Yeah.
Very thankfully, my 3-year-old especially seemed to have quite a decent comprehension of it for somebody of his age, and he ended up asking if he could name my cancer. He found the word cancer quite scary. He found it all a bit overwhelming, so he asked if he could name it. He gave us 2 choices. He's a very strong-willed little boy. He didn't wait for us to ask if he had choices. He told us he had 2 choices. So the choices were either Superjet Blaze, which we decided overall was a little bit too cool a name. It sort of glorified cancer a little bit too much. And the other one he came up with was Dave. So we ended up calling my cancer Dave. We haven't stopped calling it Dave either, and we ended up nicknaming our car Superjet Blaze just so he could call something. But we felt that Dave was a really good name for it as well. It was, it's only one letter difference from my own name, Dale, which meant it was very similar to me and it was sort of part of me. Dave, I mean, we all know a Dave who turns up to the house, who's you've struggled to get to leave, who's the house guest from hell. Whether they're called Dave or whatever, we all know somebody like that. We've all got a friend who is, outstays their welcome every time, who you just want rid of, who's irritating, who's painful, and all these things. And it just seemed to fit really well with cancer. So
Yeah.
to this day, my kids ask me how Dave is doing, whether Dave has gone yet. When can we finally say goodbye to Dave? And they ask me on a bi-daily basis, and it's fantastic. It means that we can
Yeah.
have open conversations about it. First of all, that don't feel like they're depressive, as a lot of cancer conversations do. It also means that if we're out in public and I'm having a moment where my esophagus is hurting, because obviously where it is, the location of my tumor means that sometimes it hurts and food hits it and it's painful, etc. It
Mm.
means if I'm having a moment like that, my kids can ask without feeling awkward in public. They can stop and ask, I can see Dave is hurting you at the moment, Daddy. Are you okay? And it means that we as a family have a way to deal with it that feels, it doesn't just feel normalized, it also feels not scary because,
Mm.
who knows a scary Dave? Dave isn't scary in any way, shape, or form. I mean, he's called Dave. Um, and it also means that they have something that they feel is a little bit of a fun secret, as it were. It
Yeah.
means that they don't mind talking about it, that it isn't scary, it isn't all these things, because it's our little code for it, and therefore it makes it okay for them as well. So
Mm.
we've tried to take it in that direction. We've tried to make it not a fun thing, but we've tried to make it an acceptable thing to talk about. We've tried to normalize it. So when we're out to a restaurant, etc., we will talk to waiters about it. We will talk to anybody about it at any different moment, because it then normalizes it and takes away the power of the cancer
Exactly.
on the mental state. It stops my kids
Yeah.
from being scared and worried on a daily basis by normalizing it that much. Yeah, we've given so many waiters and people in shops and all sorts the fright of their lives when they ask a random question and we turn around and start talking about cancer. But
Yeah.
it's helped our kids. It's also helped us quite a lot mentally as well, because it's taken the burden off of us. It's stopped it feeling like the big scary wolf in the corner. And it now just
Mm.
feels like it's part and parcel of us. And
Yeah.
sadly, never going anywhere. It's one of those things that I will be dealing with for the rest of my life, because even if I do get nared in the next sort of 6 months or so, I will still have to stay on my protocol for a number of years afterwards, and I will still have a high likelihood of getting cancer again in my life. And
Mm.
therefore, it's good that we've done it this way because it's taken that mental burden away.
Yeah. Dale, there's such a powerful conversation and a powerful concept to what you've just spoken about. We've spoken with several women obviously that go through significant hardship, and the idea of you wanting to, and I understand it, you wanted to keep that close to your chest, and you don't know how to talk about it. A lot of people have issues putting words to what they're going through, never mind with their kids as well. And everything you've talked about, this idea of acceptance, normalizing the conversation, being able to talk about it somewhat objectively, almost making light of it, is such a powerful concepts, which I think so many people can take away with anything when it comes to adversity, where, as you're saying, it's not, obviously, it is what it is, right?
Yeah.
But the way that you talk about it and respond to it can be everything in terms of that mindset, and being able to have that conversation openly with everyone. I mean, I can't imagine what you'd think about in the first instance of how do you even begin to have this conversation with your children, right? But then to have this and then to almost give them that platform where they can talk about it so openly, where, as you're saying, the more you talk about it with a level of anxiousness, and it gives it power. I think, as you said, that's the key thing, is unintentionally it becomes this big scary thing which we don't know how to deal with, and because we don't know how to deal with it, we don't talk about it, and then it's that vicious cycle. The more you don't talk about it, the bigger it gets, the more you don't want to talk about it. And by leveling that and giving it, like, a human name, and something that you can relate to, something, and that's the biggest thing. Like, most people, why would you ever have related to this thing beforehand? So I think there's just so much to what you've just discussed, and isn't it amazing that it comes from a child, right? Isn't that amazing? Like, the wonder of how they look at things never ceases to amaze me, and how they look at the world, and us being humble enough to kind of run with that, and then what that allows you to do. I think there's just so much there which I can, very inspiring in terms of
Well,
what
that
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 does.
lead that
Yeah.
lead from children was also why we ended up talking about it openly in public as well,
Mm.
because children really don't have that filter. They want to talk about it. They don't look at the context or the situation they're sat in, and therefore, to them, having an open conversation about cancer when you're out for a family dinner in a restaurant is
Yeah.
perfectly normal and natural to them. So we ended up embracing that. And I would point out, at first, it felt horrible. At first,
Mm.
it was so unnatural, sitting in a restaurant talking about cancer in front of people we don't know,
Yes.
talking to the waiter about it. When I'm explaining that I have to have specific dietary requirements because of this vegetarian keto diet and all these kind of things,
Mm.
explaining it to a waiter in that way also felt beyond unnatural. It was horrendous at first. It gives you that gut wrench of like you're standing on stage, like you're giving a presentation to 5,000 people. It's gut.
Mm.
But the second you get past that, it becomes so easy and it makes the conversations far more natural with the family, with my children specifically. And it made it far easier for me to talk to, well, like to yourself, Patrick. It made it far easier for me to talk about it in general and to offer both my help, support, and everything else I'm trying to do via LinkedIn and the other platforms I use.
Yeah.
So
No, it's
I'm
yeah.
thankful for the child's mind, for my little kids wanting that, because it pushed me to deal with it better.
Yeah. And I think, part of the reflection, that I find myself going through as you're talking is, obviously everyone's journey will be different. I think from this conversation, I hope people can take the inspiration about certain ways that, you've dealt with it, and the benefits of going through it, that level of discomfort you went through and overcame to get to a better place where you think you are now, to be able to talk about it. Everyone's journey could be different. Every family's could be different. Would this be a different conversation if your kids were 10 and 13? Probably would be, in different ways. So I think this isn't a prescription or a way to deal with it by any means, but I think it is certainly one where you can attest to the value that is given you. And for people listening in, it's more just the idea that there are ways. I think there's general principles. How you get there is different, obviously, but the idea of acceptance, normalizing the conversation, having something that you as a family can relate to, and being open, I think, with your kids with any level of adversity, I think are general principles which I think stand the test of time. The idea of, again, not feeling the natural feelings of guilt and shame, and forecasting into the future. That's going to be normal, and there will be periods where you go through that, and everyone will have to go through that at varying levels of pace, right? How quickly you go through that. But there is a journey, and there are ways that hopefully people can take inspiration from what you've done, and how you're facing it and still are facing it, right? I mean, this is not a happily ever after story as it is right now. We're not looking back on something. We
Yeah.
are going through this at the moment. And I wonder if there's a conversation in terms of, you've reflected on things that you've done to date, but there are still going to be those things, those wobbles that you have on the journey. And how do you maintain your level of resilience and hope as to what you're going through? Can you talk a bit about what it is you're doing now, um, you know, as of today, and what keeps you in this, in a better state of mind as you go through, this journey?
So I'm not sure there's any one thing that keeps me in a better state of mind. For me, it's very much sort of the culmination of things that have put me in a great state of mind, as opposed to finding a singular thing that works.
Hmm.
I should point out at this stage that I went through the same stages that anybody goes through in this sort of a thing. I went through the denial, I went through the depression, especially around my mother's death at the same time, and my sort of pending sense of doom at that point in time. I went through all of those feelings and realized that they do no good. It took me, I think it actually took me the depression of my mother's death in order to face up to my own prognosis, as it were. It made me so low and it made me feel so horrendous that I had to fight upwards because it was the only way to go at that point in time. I went through the thoughts of suicide. I went through the thoughts of maybe it would be easier if I just went and killed myself now because, well, we all go through that with cancer, unfortunately. And when you're told that you have 12 months to live and that this will be progressive and that you will get worse and that the pain will get worse, that your quality of life will drop significantly and that the fight ahead will ultimately lead to your death. You go through the stage of, well, why don't I cut things short and just go and do this myself now? But for me, it was the pushing past that. It was the realization that every moment matters. It was the realization that no matter the state I was in, if I could go and spend some time with my children and make them happy, then that time would matter over the longer term to them and to me and to my sense of self. So I pushed through because of the people I had in my life. I pushed through because of my partner, because of my kids and because of the time that it meant I could have with them.
Mm.
Thankfully, I also then discovered ways in order to make the standard of care more efficacious and efficient, and managed to find ways to essentially better the cancer care I was getting in order to try and beat this thing, which has given me a possibility at potentially going into remission in the next year or so. Uh, yeah, it was my kids that gave me the mental strength to fight it. It was my kids who've given me the good days. It was my kids who gave me the strength. It
Mm.
was them coming along and giving me cuddles, the day after I was diagnosed, coming and cuddling up in bed with me and telling me it
Mm.
would be okay, which for a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old is just everything.
It's such a hard hitting conversation. Again, I have so much respect for what you've been through, and a lot of admiration. Um, as you're talking, we've heard before this idea that I think any parent can understand the idea that you live more for the kids than you do for yourself sometimes, don't you? It's such an interesting reflection where oftentimes, again, when we talk about adversity, how do you get through it? It's often you get through it less so for yourself, but more for other people. All right, your wife, your kids, your parents, etc. And that is the I don't know the fuel also to get you through those hard times. And it's just so interesting that we do it more so for other people than for ourselves. And then obviously that then becomes, we realize we have to look after ourselves for other people, right? We hear about mothers going through adversity, and the first thing they forsake is themselves. Not just mothers, any parent. I did it to a certain extent, but we forsake ourselves because we're like, well, we don't matter because we have to be there for other people. So it's that you draw strength from those people, but then you realize the only way I can be good for these guys is if I look after myself. So therefore,
Yeah,
you look after yourself for other people, right? And that then becomes your purpose and your reason to be. And
it's a
it's
very
such an
important point.
it's such an interesting idea. Like we don't do it for ourselves, do we? We do it for others.
And I think that's a very interesting point and a very important one, Patrick, is that in order to look after other people, we have to look after ourselves. And very thankfully for me, once my partner had sort of begun recovering, first of all, she went off and retrained as a phlebotomist and cannulation expert in order to cannulate and take my bloods and stuff at home.
Mm.
Amazing woman, by the way. My other half is beyond incredible. But she also then took over pretty much the majority of the family, day-to-day pieces to give me the time and the space, first of all, to do my protocol, because I was spending between 4 and 6 hours every single day in some form of treatment. And that was atop the chemotherapy, the immunotherapy, and all the other things. So probably averaging even more than that. And then on top of that, I was also doing a lot of reading at that point in time to try and find other ways and other things to add to it and to add to my knowledge base. So my partner had picked up and basically took over the entire family life in order to give me the space to look after myself so that I could then come back and look after her and the kids. And that's exactly what happened. She ended up very selflessly taking that on. And I have then tried my best since to give her some of that space back so that we can both share this load and that we can both be there for each other and our children. But in order to get there, we had to allow some time to focus on the self.
Yeah, no, that's incredible. And it's so great to hear that sense of gratefulness that you have. And I think it is obviously, it's I know it's cliche, but it'll be times like this that you start to appreciate exactly what you do have, right? And I think, you start to see that because everyone rushes through life and, the job, the work, the mortgages, etc. And you kind of just get used to a certain level of whatever that is. And then it's only at these times when you're like, look at what I do have. And that's when it really stands a test. So I wanted to talk briefly about, this is an incredible story that you have and are still living. You're doing some incredible work. Now, we don't have time, as you mentioned, to go through the details of what that is, but I would love to give an opportunity for you to talk briefly about the work you are doing, that people can follow you, and talk about what is, well, there's the blog, there's the business and the charity, right? And I think all of
Yeah.
those have been obviously driven by that adversity. But now what has come out of it are these incredible resources and hopefully services that people can benefit from that aren't as readily available right now.
So I think there's no one source that I could sort of earmark as being valuable. Well,
Yeah.
actually, I say that in an oncological setting, if we're looking at cancer specifically, there is one, which is How to Starve Your Cancer by Jane McClelland. It's probably the top selling cancer book on earth, I believe, at the moment. It's the only New York Times best-selling piece of literature around cancer. Jane is a really fantastic human being. Myself and Jane have now actually, we're in the process of starting a charity called Beyond the Standard. And the idea is that all of the therapies and off-label meds, etc., that I have used on my journey, many of which Jane also used on hers. She was also a stage 4 cancer patient who's also used a lot of the same things in order to overcome her cancer and is now fully in remission, etc. We have started a charity in order to try and get information out. Because as it stands right now, if you were to go onto any of the Facebook groups or any of these sorts of things, there's a lot of talk of, horse medications and dog medications and all these things which aren't really cures in any way, shape, or form and are potentially very dangerous and harmful for people. We want to instead provide a data set and a set of information that people can rely on and that is accurate and isn't harmful to people. And as well, we want to try and lobby the UK government for some changes to things like there used to be a bill called the Repurposed Medications Bill in the UK that was unfortunately repealed a few years ago. And we want to try and lobby for things like that to be brought back in so that more of this information can make its way into the mainstream and actually be used properly. And then with that, as you mentioned, we also have a business. So I am in the process of also setting up an oncology clinic. And it is now going to be a purely oncology focused clinic that allows access to, and we have an integrative oncologist who's on board, etc., that allows access to some of these more alternative complementary therapies that are there to be used alongside the standard of care, not instead of. They are there to increase the efficacy of chemotherapy, of immunotherapy, to reduce the side effects, and to help people to generally cope better with life with cancer than they are able to by just using the standard of care. It's going to be a little while until our clinic is off the ground. We are just going out for investment as it stands at the moment, and we're hoping to launch it mid to late next year.
That's great. And I know that behind the scenes, there's some incredible people involved with what you're doing. So, we'll share the details of what that is so people can follow you or support or, provide. And that book you mentioned was How to Starve Your Cancer, right? It's,
Yeah.
we'll make sure
So Jane McClellan was very much sort of the front runner, the luminary, the visionary, however you want to put it. Back in the 90s, she had stage 4 cancer herself, and she has managed to cure herself twice, I believe, using this sort of an approach.
Yeah,
Really incredible woman.
that's incredible. And I think The last point I would make on that is I think you talk appropriately about, although it's called alternative, it's almost a bit misleading because it's not alternative, it's complementary. Because the idea is that we're not trying to, this isn't about dismissing what exists right now. It's like looking at what exists and how do I make that, what are the complementary things that make that even more effective? And that's a
Exactly.
really key point, despite the term that is used. This is about looking at the science, looking at the literature, and understanding how can I make the best out of what is currently available to improve my odds of success around treatment. So I wonder if we wrap up there. I mean, there's a lot more we can go into in other streams, but I feel like for this conversation, being able to talk about the adversity that hit you, the resilience that you show and continue to show, and what has enabled you to do that, whether it's the normalizing of conversation, finding your level of purpose around education, and charting your own path, and then the elements of what hope looks like and continues to look like has been, I think, one for me truly fascinating. So thank you again, Dale, for sharing your journey and continuing to share your story with people. I think it hopefully gives a lot of hope to people going through any level of adversity in their lives. Also want to shout out to the blog that you write, just to promote that and tell people where to find you. I'd love to, again, if people are as inspired as I think hopefully there's a lot of great that can be done for people out there. So please tell people where to find you and more about what you're doing.
Yeah, of course. So the blog is called thelifeorganic.com. And I'm also available. I do a lot of stuff on LinkedIn. I think I'm Dale J. Atkinson on LinkedIn. And I've recently started a Facebook page as well. So either under The Life Organic or under Dale Atkinson. So please feel free to reach out to check out anything. And if you have any questions as well, please do reach out to me directly. I'm more than happy to answer any questions.
Fantastic. Nothing left for me to say, but thank you, Dale. Thanks for sharing your time and for your story. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Dale.
Thank you for having me.
Cheers.